Well, hello and welcome out to yet another Jitterbit Tech Talk. I'm Corey Willis. I'm your host today. I'm Director of Product Education here at Jitterbit, but we do have a special treat for you here in studio today. Special guest, Jacob Stanton. Jacob is our Senior Data Architect here at Jitterbit. Jacob, you've been with us a little over 7 years.
Yes.
You've got history prior to coming on board with Jitterbit, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, that was what, about 2 or 3 years that you worked with the product before coming on?
Well, unfortunately, I'm showing my age here, but it was almost 7 years working with the product, and I've been at Jitterbit for another 7 years.
Okay, so a lot of experience that we brought in studio today to talk to you guys. And what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be going into some best practices and some frequently asked questions around some things that come up from time to time. And a lot of it's going to be around environments and project migration, project variables, how all of these different things intertwine. And as part of the reason why I brought Jacob on with us today here live in the March 2020 Tech Talk is because even before some of these features were in the Jitterbit product, Jacob, you were doing some of these things way back in a different way, and it's evolved a lot into what we have in the product today, right?
Absolutely. A lot of the things we were doing a long time ago before they were features in the product, they're features in the product because of the way we had to do them.
Mm-hmm. So let's just go ahead and dive in, and today's going to be a little bit different than some of our previous Tech Talks. If you've been joining us, and if you have, welcome back. If you haven't, thanks for coming out and checking this out. I do want to let you know the Tech Talks, we do archive these out. They are out on Success Central. So if this is your first time coming to a Jitterbit Tech Talk and you find it interesting, want to check out some of the previous things we've done, you can always go there. We'll talk more about that at the end. But we do archive these out. One of the things that I think sets Tech Talks apart is at the end, we open up for full Q&A. If you've got a question, even if it's not directly related to our content today, this gives you an opportunity to ask that question, and we will do our best to answer it. We may not always be able to. If we can't, we make our commitment that we will get back with you with the answer as best we can. So with that, let's go in. We're just going to kind of do some discussion and really just get some of Jacob's insights on how to work in some of these scenarios. And then a little bit later, we will dive in and show you some of this in the product itself. But let's start, Jacob, we were talking a little bit earlier before the broadcast started just about how users should really set up their environments. You know, Jitterbit, whether we're using the Design Studio or the Cloud Studio, doesn't matter, but with the Harmony platform, we have the ability to have multiple environments. Some customers may only have 2, some have more, but Jacob, how would you set that up if you were a customer?
So I would really recommend that you follow your business practices. So if you have a production environment, obviously in Jitterbit, you also have a production environment. You have a dev environment. You also have a dev environment in Jitterbit. You may have a QA1, QA2, QA3, whatever. You just reproduce those inside Jitterbit. So that way, when you think about production, you're thinking about one environment. And then you make sure that the hardware behind those also lines up. So you obviously don't want to share dev, QA, production all on the same agent group.
And that's a good point, is we're talking environments, and I think sometimes people might get a little confused if they're newer to Jitterbit, because we separate environment, it's kind of a virtual world, versus the agent groups, which actually support those environments, right?
Yes, absolutely. There's quite a bit of confusion behind that.
So let's talk about agent groups then, and then we'll circle back to environments. With agent groups, that's that runtime that's actually doing all the work. That's the workhorse, right?
Absolutely. An agent group is a group of agents, and that agent group can service multiple environments. So you can have a QA1, QA2, QA3 all being serviced by the same group of agents. And that really is where the problem comes in also, because people are like, oh, well, I'll just save a little money and also make it service production. No, don't do that. Keep dev, QA separate from production.
Gotcha. So with those agents, we can also do cloud, or we can do on-premise with a local or a private agent. It doesn't even have to be on-premise. It could be in your own private cloud. It doesn't really matter where that's at. Again, if you're not familiar, those can run on Linux or Windows, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So cross-platform there. But let's break that down. So we can run these in groups, and we can group those together. So in a production, if you're running cloud, we kind of manage this.
Yeah, we manage it for you.
But if you're running a private agent group, then for production, we would always suggest having at least 2 agents in a group, right?
Absolutely, for HA availability.
Right. So that way, if you've got a machine that fails, the other one picks up and starts running the processes. Well, I probably didn't even word that very well because they're both cooperating.
That's true. They're round robin to start with, and then when one of the agent goes down, it's taken out of the cluster, so the other one continues getting all the load.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily like a hot spare or a warm spare or anything like that. It's out there. It's trucking along. It's doing its thing. But for a production private agent group, always have multiple agents.
I don't see why not. I mean, you just want the HA availability. Now, there's always going to be situations where people don't want to manage it, or that maybe they can't afford it. But in a really good environment, you're always going to want to, even if you have very low load. We do have customers, obviously, that have high load that go 3, 4, 5 agents, but that's the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, 2 agents is where you want to stay at.
Now, if somebody's wondering how do I actually set that up, how should I structure that for my process, they can always reach out to our support team, right?
Absolutely. So support helps people set this up every single day.
So always something you can reach out. We're here to help you. But now let's talk about more that QA dev side of things. We don't want those environments that are kind of those virtual containers, so to speak. We don't want those running on the production agent group. And why is that?
Well, I mean, your devs are testing stuff. They're doing new stuff. It's totally untested. It's, what if you do an infinite loop? All of a sudden you've taken production down. So you want to keep the devs away from production. Also, if you're SOC certified or any other type of audit, they're going to want that segregation of duties and segregation of environments.
Okay. So now within that, say we're running a dev and a QA, those could both run on one single agent group that maybe only has one agent in it.
It's very possible.
Depending on scale.
Yeah, it depends on scale, depending on your internal policies, depending on your internal staff. That's where I go back. You want to reproduce what you currently have. So if you have a QA team and you have a dev team and they're totally separate, they don't interact with each other, maybe you want 2 separate pieces of hardware or 2 separate VMs behind it. But if you have one team, some of them are dev, some of them are QA, they mix back and forth all the time, one piece of hardware really makes sense.
So what I'm really hearing here is that it goes back to what's your business structure?
Absolutely.
What's your team structure? How does all that play out? And it's going to be different for different clients, and that's okay.
Yes.
So now that we've kind of talked about that, let's go back to the environments, because we've already said the environments, you can have multiple environments on a single agent group, or you could have a different agent group for each environment. You can structure that however you need to. Mm-hmm. But what would be the typical, and I know there is no real true typical.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But what would be more the typical structure of those environments?
Okay, I would say over 80% of the customers have one agent group that they use for production, and then they have one agent group they use for dev, and a very high percentage of them have one agent group that they use for QA. So 3 environments is very, very common.
Okay. So now that leads us to another topic that I think brings confusion sometimes. A lot of people, especially in the Salesforce world, they think of a term that's labeled out there, a sandbox.
Yes.
In the Jitterbit world, we do have something we call a sandbox, right?
Yes, and there was a lot of debate on what to call it. We wanted another environment that is available for the customers that they could run something on that maybe wasn't as beefy as production, but at the same time had the new version of the code out there. It was just something they could test with. If they killed it, no problem. But the terminology has definitely confused some people.
And what the proper terminology is we call it the Jitterbit Sandbox Agent Group.
Yes.
Now this is cloud. So we've switched the discussion to cloud. I know we're kind of jumping back and forth, but there's a lot to cover here. But this is going back to the cloud world. So in cloud, you have the Jitterbit production cloud agent group that you can run on.
Yes.
Okay. You can run dev, QC, QA, you can run all that on there if you want to. We're going to get into some specifics on our suggestions on that in a moment. But we also have this Jitterbit Sandbox cloud agent group. Okay. So what you're saying here is that this may not, most likely is not the same release version that's running in production, correct?
Depends on the release schedule.
Okay.
Most of the time it is about 30 days ahead of production. Now, obviously, when we release the Sandbox, it's already went through QA. It's already released to the public. We already have it on our production website for download. So if you download a private agent, that's the version you're going to be getting. But the production one is about 30 days behind. And we do that just so if our QA missed something, if disaster happens, we want to protect that production cloud agent group beyond all of them.
Yeah. So guys, this is one of those things where when there is a new release coming out, if you're running on cloud, you can go and run this in the Sandbox agent group and make sure that everything is working properly in your project before the upgrade happens. Right?
And that's really the objective there, so that we can have customers use it in their dev environment. They can see something, they can test it, they can say, okay, I'm going to deploy my project to it, I'm going to run it against my dev environment, everything works great, we're good to go for the next release.
Okay. Now you mentioned something there that leads us into the next side of this conversation, is that you said in their dev environment.
Yes.
So if we're running, say, a triple environment scenario of production, QA, and development, how would we isolate those to the various agent groups? Would there be a recommendation?
It's personal preference, but my recommendation is put your dev on the Sandbox, put your QA and production on the normal production. That way, your developer is testing to make sure everything's working. Your QA team is testing exactly versions that it's going to be running in production. So when you go from QA to production, it literally doesn't even move machines. It's on the same machines.
Gotcha. So again, if we separate these out, production QA run on what we call the production cloud agent group.
Yes.
Unless, of course, QA needs to run there because of some upgrade, something or other. But by default, we would typically say run that on production. But dev, run on Sandbox.
Yes.
And that also isolates that out. Now, granted, the cloud, we've got several other security controls and things like that. But it's just a safety factor.
Absolutely,
right?
It's a safety factor. And we do have guardrails up. And if you do something stupid on the cloud, we're probably going to stop you and not let you do it. But at the same time, if you do something stupid and 40 other people do it at the same time, well, that may overload our guardrail. So we do recommend people move their dev environments to the Sandbox. And as far as physical, they're the exact same machines. They're the same builds of machines, same hardware, same memory. It's just there's not as many of them. And we do scale based on load. So if everybody that has a Jitterbit account moved over to the dev, move their dev over to Sandbox, we would increase the number of machines in that group to make sure that it could handle the load.
Gotcha. Okay, so again, just when we're talking Sandbox, when Jitterbit's talking Sandbox, we're talking about a Sandbox cloud agent group. That's what we're talking about. When we say Sandbox, we're not talking about your dev environment. Okay, so I think that's an important distinction for our customers, because like I said, in the Salesforce world, there are so many that they think Sandbox and they're thinking the dev environment.
Yes.
And so that is a little different here. And so we want to take a minute to clarify that, since we're talking environments and agent groups anyway. So we've talked about kind of the best practices of how to structure those environments. Mm-hmm. Now, what about using them? What would we do in our project design that might be a little different in our thought process of using multiple environments?
Well, obviously you have to think about not only am I designing for the cloud, but I'm also designing to be able to migrate environments. So I'm in my dev environment, I'm setting up my project. Do I want my project to have a database source, for example? Well, is that source a project variable, or is it a hard-coded name of a database server? If it's a hard-coded name of a database server, you migrate it from dev to production, it's not going to change. It's going to still be there. But if it's a project variable, you migrate from dev to production, well, that variable is different in your production environment or your production project. That way you can migrate 2, 3, 4 times, and you don't have to keep changing passwords. You don't have to keep changing names or anything like that. When you migrate the project, it knows that it's in production and it runs accordingly.
Gotcha. So this is one of the topics that comes up sometimes is, well, and I'm putting myself in the persona of a customer. In our world, when we deploy a project, it needs to be 0 changes from QA.
Yes.
So using what you're talking about with project variables in this, that allows that to happen.
That's exactly the way you use it.
You don't have to modify the project before you deploy it.
Correct.
Now, what if you're dealing with obviously when we're working with this, we're working with dev databases and production databases and whatnot. If there are potential schema changes there where the environment, say, might be out of sync, then maybe there's a scenario where there has to be something refreshed because the systems aren't in sync.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is a scenario that you would have to open up the production project and refresh the transformation. It would depends on the change. I mean, if you're dropping a bunch of fields that are in dev and not in production, okay, you're going to have to change those mappings. But hopefully, your dev and your production environments are very, very close to being the same, so you will not have that issue.
Well, and again, just going back to a typical best practice, and this is kind of stepping out of the Jitterbit world for just a moment. Really, you should keep those systems, as similar as possible.
Correct.
When you're testing in QA, you move to production. If production is different from QA on your endpoints, you're going to have challenges there.
Yes.
So, well, guys, what I want to do, I want to take you in and show you a little bit of this in the design environments. I'm going to show you a little bit both in the Cloud Studio and the Design Studio. So we're touching both of these today in just how to actually go about this. I want to start in Cloud Studio, and I want to show you kind of how we would design with these project variables. And I've got a little start here, but let's go ahead and go to the screen and pull this up. And so this is a new project that I just started right before the broadcast. And what I'm going to do, let me just start here. All I've done so far is that I've come over here. You see right here, we've got the project name. Below there, we've got the environment. Right now, I'm in my default environment. Okay, so I'm going to come down here to project variables using the little 3-dot icon here. Go to the project variables, and I've already populated these. This is all I've done in this project. Okay, and so I've just put in things like my Salesforce security token, password, username, database. This is a super simple example. I just wanted something to show you guys. But I've already populated all of this data here as project variables. Now, as I go back, what I'll be able to do is scroll down here in my connectors. And again, it's not so much the operation that I'm building, it's the method that I'm using here. But I'm going to go to Salesforce. There's my Salesforce endpoint. And see right here, Sandbox. Yeah, it's another point of confusion, right?
Absolutely.
Because you get the Salesforce Sandbox. We've talked about this some. But notice here on username, I could type in my username directly. But that doesn't really help me when I'm in the mindset of this has to be able to be migrated into my production environment later on. So instead, I can come over here, choose the little variable icon, and all my variables pop up that I've already created in my project variable list. And so now this is my Salesforce username, so I just select Salesforce username. And of course, I get my little pop-up there showing what the label is and the value and the description and things like that. So I'll just choose that. And then down here on password, same type of thing. Salesforce password. Of course, this one was set as non-viewable. I forget what we call it, hide it or whatever. And so it started out there for obvious reasons on a password.
Just to inject here, we do a whole lot more on that than just hide the password. There is a AES 256 encryption behind that. Every customer has their own encryption key. So we go above and beyond to keep that password secure and safe. But if there is customers that have security concerns, not only are we willing to talk to you, but we have other methods that you can even pull that password out and only have that on the local agent, so it's never in our cloud.
So this is why I love having Jacob with us, is we get to go into the deeper tech things that we normally wouldn't. So awesome information. So going on here, I'll do the security token next and choose that. And then let's go ahead and run a little test. That's successful. We save the changes. So now we've configured that endpoint with those variables, and we can use those variables going forward. Now, as I go into this, again, I'm just going to kind of toss together a quick operation here. I'm going to do a Salesforce query. And so I'll drag this over. I also need a database endpoint. That's the other piece that I'm going to use in this. And so let's go on down here to the database. There it is, database connector. And I'm going to do the same type of thing. Now, I do have to specify my driver. Obviously, this wouldn't be that great of a scenario if you're trying to go between, say, a Postgres and a SQL server.
That is correct. Also, between operating systems, if it's ODBC, you have problems with the name.
Yep. So good stuff to know, kind of keeping your environments the same, which is just good best practice, right?
Absolutely.
So let's go on down through here. Let's see, server name is going to be my database host. Database name is my database. My login here is my username. My password is my database password. So pretty simple stuff. Let's see if I type this stuff in properly. Hey, I did. Awesome. Always good when you type things in right. So now I can go to my database and say I want to do a little insert. Again, I'm not really focusing too much on the operations itself, but just showing you how to do some of this. But I do want to complete this so we can show you another step of this. And so I'm going to go ahead and go configure this query. And I'm just going to choose account. Like I said, I'm just going to keep this super simple. And so we've got all of our account fields there. That should be fine. We'll just choose everything. Again, just doing stuff super simple here. On my database insert, I'm going to go find my customer table. If you guys have been through training, these structures should seem fairly similar because that's what I'm using is the training learning sandbox. If you haven't been through that, I'd encourage you to go check that out. Again, we've got that new course out there, and you could go check that out and learn a little bit more about the scripting here in Cloud Studio and how that may be a little bit different from Design Studio if that's more what you're familiar with. Of course, typically I should be naming all of these things as I go. I'm not doing that just for the sake of time. And so apologies if you're one that you always want to see things followed just right there. But like I said, I just want to get through this. And so that's fine. I'm just going to map the one field. That should work fine for what I want to do and ultimately what I want to show you guys. So there's that. I've got an operation. I can deploy that out. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about migration and how we kind of go through some of that. But before we do, I want to jump over to the Design Studio and kind of show how this is done there. Okay, so a little bit different just because it is a different design platform. But here in Design Studio, I've done a little bit more over here just to save us some time. But notice right here is our project variables in Design Studio. I've done it the same way, same values, everything's really the same. I did go ahead and build out the operation here. Now, one thing I do want to show you, in the Design Studio, we don't have the little variable icon. And so if you haven't done this before, the methodology of using a project variable in some of these may be a little foreign to you. So I want to show that. And so if I were to come in here and say, I just want to do a new database connection, I'll do it as a database source. We're not going to use it. But if I were going to do this, again, we select our driver. And so that's really just the same as in the Cloud Studio. But here on server name, like I said, there's not the little variable icon that brings that drop down. The way you get it here is you start with an open square bracket. And that gets you your variable drop-down list. Now, there's some other things you can do here as far as default values and things like that. But if you're using project variables, it's not necessary. So we can actually go in here and say, okay, our server name is, nope, it's not that one. It's my host. That's the one that I want. So there it is, database host. My database name is the database. Login name is the database. Username and password is my password. Okay. And let's test that connection. And it goes out, uses those project variables, and pulls all that back. Okay. So that's how we would do it. And if we go in and say, look at the Salesforce side of things, let's see where it's at, right there. Notice that, Salesforce login, square bracket, SF, username, again, that same structure over here. So that would be really the biggest thing, right, Jacob, as far as designing your projects to be able to use this. And that sets the stage for doing migrations, right?
It really does. And also, you want to use the best practices in general. For example, you don't want to use a local file if you're going to be migrating to a server with a different file structure. Usually using temp space is much easier and quicker. but we do have quite a few people that enable the local file. Just be wary of that when you're migrating to new environments.
Gotcha. Now with temp, if you're doing large files, that could be a little problematic, right? That's more for smaller data that you want to pass through.
Well, large is a relative term.
It is.
So if you're doing, let's say, a 20 gig file, maybe you want to think about how the workflow flows. If you're doing a 100 meg file, man, who cares? Put it anywhere.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've set the stage. Now you mentioned about just following best practices, and this is one thing I didn't mention, was following a proper naming convention.
Oh, absolutely. This is so critical. And when you're designing a project, think about how is it going to be maintained over the next several years. Good naming convention makes it easier to maintain. And I promise you, 2 years from now, you go back to the same project, you're not going to remember everything. You're going to have to rely on what did you document, what naming conventions did you use, and that's going to make it the change that you make 2 years from now. Is it 5 minutes, or is it going to take you several hours to figure out what happened?
Well, and we had a little side conversation earlier, and you never want to be that person that opens up a project and sees that best practices weren't followed and starts fussing at the author to find out that it was you.
Yes.
I know. We've never
guilty.
done that, right? Yeah, of course we're guilty. We've done it, and that's part of why we harp so much on following best practices, is because we felt the pain. So in this case, I just chose a fairly simple naming convention. If we hop back over to the screen here, for my Salesforce variables, it was SF dot whatever. For my database, it was DB dot whatever. And so, we went through and just chose something real simple. The important thing is that you just follow a convention.
Yes.
There's not really a specific that we say, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to name it. We give some suggestions, but ultimately, as long as it's consistent within your organization.
Absolutely.
That's what matters.
When you're doing these naming conventions, like Corey's here, db.host. Well, I would probably recommend db. What do you call that server? Oh, I'm going to call that my production server. I'm going to call that my weird name that IT requires. So whatever you call that server, put that there, because like I said, a year from now, you're not going to remember what server you're actually connecting to. You're going to be relying on that name.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, I made it very generic because we're just looking at some of the high level things here. But let's talk about migration now, and we want to get to some Q&A before too much longer. So I haven't been watching the Q&As as they come through, but if you have a question, again, directly related or not, go ahead and be putting those in the chat. And once we get to our Q&A, we will go through those and do our best to answer every question that does come through as best it can. But let's go ahead and take a look here. And so I'm going to start in the Design Studio since that's what I have up. And if we go to File, and as we come down here, there's an option to say Migrate Project. Now this project's new, so the wizard's going to be a little bit different, but you get to select which environment you want to go to. Now I'm in my default environment. For me, that's kind of my dev that I'm in here. So I'm going to choose Tech Talk. And so I'm migrating from default to Tech Talk. And then I have the option here to open that. I don't need that right now. But in some scenarios, particularly if you're not using project variables, or in this case, with a first migration, we would need to update those project variables. Subsequent, we wouldn't have to worry about it, right?
Yeah, I usually go ahead and open it just because I always want to double check everything.
Yeah.
So it really depends on your personal preference and what you like to do.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and do it just to show you guys what it's like. We'll click Next, and let me expand this a little bit here, see if we can get a little more of this on screen. There we go. That's doing a little bit better. And so schedules, you may not want to migrate schedules. And I'll tell you, from my experience, this applies a lot when you're kind of backwards migrating, so to speak. If you're take a production project and you want to kind of refresh your development and bring production back to dev because somebody got in there playing around and messed something up, never happens, right? Never happens, never. So in those cases, you may not want to bring the schedules over. So you can choose whether or not to include that. Success and failure emails, same thing. You may not want those to come over.
Yeah, I'm sure your ops team that monitors this on a daily basis will really appreciate you not migrating those from production back over to dev.
Yep. So there's there's some balance there. But notice down here, endpoints and project variables. Endpoints and project variables both fall into this category that if they have not been migrated before, then they will be migrated. If they have been, then those aren't going to be migrated by default.
Correct. And this is really where the secret sauce is. So when you migrate the variables the first time, that's you're going to have QA hostname, QA passwords in production. Then you immediately log in production and you change those to your production credentials, and then they never get copied over again.
Okay, so as we follow through the wizard here, it's going to tell us what's going in. So we can see it's not just blind. We get to see what pieces are going in. And so if we do see something that is off, something that should not be going, we can go back and kind of restructure the way we're going to do this. But in this case, I'll go ahead and click finish, and it's going to, okay, so yeah, that's fine. I hadn't deployed this, but it's still going to be able to do everything that it needs to do. And so it's going to take a few moments there. There we go. And if we go down, project variables, there they are. Okay. Now, at this point, this would be my production project. So before I deploy it, I want to go through and do my updates, right?
Yes.
So change the database host, change the Salesforce username, uncheck the Sandbox on the Salesforce side of things. Go through all of that, and once that's ready, then deploy that out.
Yes.
Now, once that's done, and let's go ahead and deploy this one so we can kind of see this here.
And just to reiterate, that only has to be done the first time.
Right, the first time. But what happens if one of those passwords changes 3 months from now?
You have to go into production and change it. You have options. You can go into the desktop studio and change it and redeploy. You can go into the WMC and change it. That really is the recommended method because you don't have to redeploy anything.
Gotcha. So that's in the management console. So let's go over here, and I'm just going to jump into this. We'll come back in a moment. But if I come to my projects within management console, this is going to bring up everything I've got here, and I've got a bunch of different things in here. So we'll have to find today's project, and there it is right there, the March 2020 Tech Talk Design Studio project. But notice down here, I've got the project variables list. So once we've deployed this out, we don't have to say, oh, the database password's changed, go update that and redeploy the project, do we?
Correct.
We can go right into here and say, okay, hey, that password changed. Let's come right over here and edit that, and we can put in a new value.
Yes. Right
here from the management console, we don't have to redeploy the project, which to a lot of our customers, that is very important to them. They've got certain controls around signing off on a QA release before it goes to production and things like that. But let's jump back and show you how this works in the Cloud Studio side of things. And then we'll be able to kind of jump to Q&A, I think. We'll just want to double check, make sure we've hit all of the topics that we meant to talk about. I can tell you one right now that we have not talked about yet, we'll get to, is that talking about multiple users.
Oh, yes.
And
absolutely.
some of that here. But let's start here. So we're in the project. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this one. And again, this is more my dev side of things. This is in my default environment. And so that's deployed out there. But right over here, kind of where we went into the project variables, right above that, we have the option for migrate. So we choose migrate. We say, where do we want this to go to? I want it to go to my Tech Talk environment, and then we migrate. Okay. And so now we're over in the Tech Talk environment. Now, some of that was kind of hidden behind the scenes here in Cloud Studio, but it's the same workflow overall.
Yes.
If we've already deployed out the changes with the endpoints and with the project variables, those don't get overwritten.
Absolutely not.
With a new migration.
It is literally the same database on the back end.
So that's kind of how we go about it. But let's pivot now, and let's talk about this multiple user side of things. And we don't have a ton of time to go into this topic, but it is something I wanted to mention. But if we're working with multiple users, and we can talk about it a little bit different between Design Studio and Cloud Studio because the workflow is a little different there.
Yes, it is.
And this is something that of course, we used to do years and years and years ago in a much more complex way. But it's a lot simpler today. But talk to me a little bit about how we would suggest somebody going through if they're going to have multiple people working on a project. And there's a side question here about how big of a project do we end up making?
Yes.
And how does that play out? But go ahead.
Well, I mean, obviously, when you have a group or a team, you always want good communication between the individuals. So with Cloud Studio, you can be working in one transformation. I can be working in another one, and it's really not a problem. I get your changes and you get mine.
So if I create a new database connection, you exit out of your transformation and go back, and there's that database connection there that you can use.
Absolutely.
But we just don't want to be in the same transformation at the same time. It's not
Correct.
like Google Docs.
It is not like Google Docs. Now, Desktop Studio is one version behind that. I can be working in an operation. You can be working in an operation, but then we have to logically combine those. So you may import my changes, or I may import yours. Or if we're not working on them at the exact same time, you've done one shift and I can go in and download your results and I can continue from there. So you really have to have better communication in Desktop Studio than you do Cloud Studio. But no matter which platform you're working in, I would recommend speaking with the other person that's working in there. Let them know what you're doing. That way you don't accidentally override each other.
Communication's
It's
key.
amazing how it all comes back to communication.
It really does. Well, let's jump back to the screen. Let me show you where this is at in Design Studio in particular, since there is a little bit more of a manual workflow here. And say, Jacob, you've been out there doing some work. Here would be my suggestion as far as a multi-user workflow, is that if I go into the studio, I know that there has even potentially been other people working on it. Maybe they forgot to communicate. They forgot to update the project, documentation or whatever. But right here, what I would do first is I would go to File and I would do an export as Jitterpack.
Well, export as Jitterpack is always a good idea as a backup. So
exactly.
You'll have a local backup with the Jitterpack. That way, nobody can change it. It's yours.
So that way, if somebody got in there changing something that they shouldn't have been,
yes,
then before I do what I'm about to do, I've got a backup.
Yeah, and when we do a deploy next, we'll show you another option as well. But go ahead with the next version.
So after that, then what I would do is I would come down and say restore project from cloud.
Yes, and when you do the restore from cloud, you get the exact version that is currently running in production or whatever environment you're running in.
So the reason I say the export as Jitterpack is so important in my world, at least, is if I were working on something and say I forgot to deploy it. Well, those changes aren't in the cloud. If I restore from cloud, then they're gone.
Yes.
So that's why I say do a Jitterpack backup first, then restore from cloud. That way you do have some mitigation if there was some miscommunication or a failure to deploy, something along those lines. But once you restore from cloud, then you have all of your changes, or you've got all the latest changes that everybody has deployed out to the cloud.
Correct.
You do the stuff you want to do in the studio. And then when you go to deploy, there's multiple ways we can deploy, right?
Oh, there's tons of ways to deploy.
So if we do the kind of what I call the master deploy, we have advanced options here where we could say, hey, just do new and modified.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about the everything button up at the top. So this is pretty critical. So when you do everything, you have the option to check the little checkbox below it, and this will create a backup of that Jitterpack. So when you do you're done with your project, you're going to deploy out to the cloud, or you're maybe at your major milestone of your project. Put some notes in here. That way, if something disastrous happens, you can always restore back to that version.
Okay, so that's the everything. Now, if we say deploy everything and somebody else has deployed a change that we don't have,
it overrides it.
It overwrites it. When you deploy everything, it's deploying that entire project.
It is.
It's overriding what's there.
And this is really the way you remove things from your project.
Yep.
So if you delete 3 or 4 sources or 3 or 4 targets and you haven't done a deploy everything, those sources and targets are actually still out on the cloud.
So you can delete them, restore from cloud, and they're back.
They are.
So that's that one. Now, if we do say just all new and modified, that's not going to remove changes. That's not going to remove something that, say, if I were deploying that you had deployed.
Correct.
That's just going to deploy what I've worked on, which is really more of a, for an incremental change, that'd be more of a best practice there, right?
Yes, it would be.
Now, if you're doing just a transformation, of course, you could also do that. Let's see, there's my transformation. It's hidden. So let's expand that. If I were in here, say, working in this transformation, I could also just deploy this one item.
Yes, you can.
And personally, that's what I'm a fan of. It's like, I know that's what I've been working on. I'm done with it. I want to deploy it, get it out there. So if you download the project, refresh the project, say 5 minutes from now, you've got my changes.
Yes.
Rather than working an entire day and then going at the end of the day, things like that. So that's some of the workflow changes. Anything else that you would suggest here in the design studio world?
No, I think you've covered it all as far as working together. And I just want to reiterate back to the communication thing.
Yeah.
You're working with someone on a project, sit down with them ahead of time, have a good design session. Maybe even include Jitterbit support from that design session, because we have found that if you spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes with support ahead of time, it can save you a lot of time in the future, because we've seen so many of these projects that we can say, oh, did you think about this? Or did you think about this? Or it just lets you do a little brainstorming that will save you time in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, guys, I think we're about ready to move into our Q&A. We've got roughly 15 minutes or so left here in the session. So we've got some time here. Before we do that, I want to give you some time to do this. So before we do, let me go ahead and just reiterate a few things that we always do here on the Tech Talks. Let's talk about some of the ways that you can find help if you need it. We've talked about support, okay? You can get support in various ways. You can email support@jitterbit.com, but there's also Success Central, and we'd always recommend checking this out, success.jitterbit.com, success.jitterbit.com. This is your Success Central portal, and you can find all sorts of product documentation out here. This is where the Tech Talks are going to be archived. Okay, so all of that's out there. Now, the next one over here, of course, is University. University.jitterbit.com. This is where our training is at. As new courses are released, you have access to those. So the new Introduction to Scripting in Cloud Studio, it is out there. Okay, if you have signed up for this and all you've looked at is foundations, there is more. Go into your course catalog, see what's out there. And finally, also the community, the Jitterbit community, community.jitterbit.com. And this is where you can go out there and you can kind of see, hey, what are other people doing? And you can pull some of that together in there. Also within the community, you have the ideas portal. So if there's something that you're wanting to see in the product, you can put that out there. People can vote on it. I suggest on a regular basis, go out there, because you may see an idea that somebody else has posted and you go, you know what, that's awesome. I need that too. And you can upvote that. So with that, let's go over to our questions here. And let's see, we've got a pretty good list. So this may take me just a moment to kind of go through here. And I'm going to go back up to the top and start working my way down here. But here's the commitment we always make to you, is that as long as there's questions coming in, and it's dangerous to say what I'm about to say, but we've never had a problem with it. We say if there's questions, we're staying online with you and going to answer those questions as best we can. Okay, so for development and production agent groups, would it be best practice to live on different servers? Would it hurt if they lived on the same VM server?
It's not so much hurting. It's a matter of it limits your ability to test. So if you have them on the same server and you are needing to make a configuration change to the server itself, you don't have a way to test that. It just goes straight in production. Or let's say you're needing to do an upgrade. You're going from, I don't know, you haven't upgraded in a long time. You're on V8 and you need to upgrade to V10. You don't have a server to do that on. So just in general, we recommend having two different environments. The other use case is developers sometimes build things that break things. So you're going to do an infinite loop. It's going to consume all the resources. Your production doesn't have any. But there's more risk involved, but it's not going to actually hurt anything to live on the same server. You just have more risk.
Now, when we're talking same server, of course, we've got that delineation between virtual servers, on the same hardware, and the same server. We can't install multiple agents on the same operating system, right?
No, I'm talking about on the same VM, the same agent name. You want to have 2 or 3 VMs on one VM host. It should work just fine. It depends on how you allocate the resources.
So it doesn't matter if we have multiple VMs running agents on the same physical hardware.
Yeah, that's correct.
So just want to make sure we were clear on that. Let's see, here's one. Somebody recently faced an issue while migrating from QA to UAT, particularly around a NetSuite connector transformation structure getting refreshed properly. Any insight to offer there?
I've never actually seen this problem, but I have seen issues when migrating from one environment to the other, and your source transformation, the source is not available at that time. Sometimes that refresh of the transformation doesn't work. I really don't know if that's related to this or not, but maybe when you were doing the migration, it wasn't available. We're happy to dig into that more with you. Just send us a quick email on support and we'll get on with you. And I'm happy to jump on as well. If the support tech that you happen to get doesn't know anything about it, they'll escalate it to me and I'll jump on with you.
So here's another one that sounds similar in nature, just from looking at it here. 2 environments for QA and dev. And this one was Dynamics 365. Some fields not showing up in the QA dev instance, even though they show in the production instance. Is there a way to force a refresh of the schema?
So in this situation right here, I would really look at, am I running the same version of Dynamics on both one? Because how did you get fields on one without on the other? As far as refreshing, yeah, you can force a refresh.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're a desktop or a cloud, but you
Right.
can definitely force a refresh.
And I'll say, if we jump back over the screen for a minute, I just want to show this real quick. Now, this is in Design Studio. Okay, in Design Studio, and I'll just show this one and then we'll jump back to the questions. But if we wanted to refresh the structures, you just right click out here and right there's refresh structures.
Correct.
And that's going to pull all those back. So that's how you do it in Design Studio. Again, we're not going to take the time to jump over into Cloud Studio on that there. But yeah, so back to questions here. So let's see, what else have we got? Best practices when collaborating with colleagues. That definitely is part of it there. Yes. That's a big part of today's discussion. There's a lot of stuff in here. Like we said, kind of best practices and FAQs. So let's see here. Going on down. Oh, here's a great one. Is the desktop or Design Studio going to be sunsetted, deprecated, so to speak? And if so, any idea on when?
I don't know. You want to ask me a technical question about Desktop Studio, I'm happy. But when it comes to product, then I'm kind of short. What I've heard is that it is not sunsetted at its current moment, and there's not plans for it in the future.
Yeah, and the same thing I've heard. So I think we're pretty comfortable with that. But yeah, there are no immediate plans as far as we know to do that. And when we say plans, there's no plans. Like, it's not just like in the very near future, we're not going to do it, but there's no plans to do it at all at this point. Who knows what's going to happen down the road, but right now there are no plans to do that. How are global variables different from project variables?
Oh, this is a good question. And they're actually very similar. A global variable is, it doesn't have a predefined value. So at the start of your project, it's nothing. Project variables have a predefined value at the start of your project, and at runtime, they become global variables. So they're just a global variable with a preset value. And Corey earlier was talking about how I was doing this before project variables even existed, and this is exactly how I did it. So I had a script that connected to an outside database and loaded in values from a key value pair table and loaded them into global variables. And I use those as project variables. So good observation that they're very close to being the same.
Yeah. So basically, a project variable is a global variable.
Yes.
But a global variable is not necessarily a project variable.
Correct, because it doesn't have a predefined value.
Okay, here's another one, and this crosses a little bit into licensing, but I want to talk about it in the context of both endpoints and environments. But do dev test count as an endpoint?
They do not.
Now we're talking endpoints.
Yes, endpoints. So we charge you for the agent for dev and test, but we do not charge you for the endpoints that dev and test connect to.
So if you're connecting to, say, your test database, your development database, and you have a production database that matches that, those don't count as extra licensing endpoints.
Correct. And we actually encourage you to connect to your test and dev endpoints because it's going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to save us a lot of time because if you just go straight to production, it's probably going to kill something, and we're going to have to be on the phone with you.
Now, as far as environments, and if you have a dev environment, a test environment, and a production environment, In the Jitterbit context of environments, those are licensed a little bit different. You may have 2 environments or 3 environments or et cetera, correct?
I'm actually not sure.
Okay.
I have seen contracts that said unlimited environments, and I've seen contracts that were limited. So I'm not really sure.
So it depends on your licensing agreement on that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see here. How to maintain versioning and auditing. Say you want to link to something like Jira. I know you've done some of this on kind of the back end.
I have. So I tell you how we do it. I export as Jitterbacks. But then at the same time, we're under a lot of auditing that we have to prove, okay, was this tested? Who tested it? How did it test? And something like that. So I'll just export it as Jitterpack, load it into Jira, and let that be my documentation trail.
Okay. Do we need to refresh any target connectors once we migrate a project?
I don't see why, unless you're having a problem with it.
I would say unless there's a discrepancy in the structure.
Yeah. That would be,
which hopefully we don't have, but yeah. Can we back up a Jitterpack in Git? Well, just like
absolutely.
With Jira.
Okay, so Git, SVN, all these other repositories. So you can absolutely back up Jitterbacks into them, as long as you are not doing the sync while the desktop studio is open. You can actually put the folder of the project directly in Git or directly in SVN and sync that folder itself.
Okay, so now we've got one that's a little bit deeper here, and I'm reading through it just to make sure that we get this. Let you take a look there as well, Jacob. But let's see. Created a project, deployed it with a backup in the cloud, exported the Jitterpack from the cloud backup, imported the Jitterpack, and created a new project. Okay, I think I may see what's going on here already. Made changes to the new project, created from the backup, and deployed the changes. I'm curious if this is Design Studio or Cloud Studio. It sounds like it's Design Studio.
Yeah, it's Design Studio.
It sounds like it may be a good thing.
It is absolutely a good thing because when, so what this user is saying they did is they created a project and then created a backup of that project and then restored that to a different folder. And they're calling it a new project, but it's really not a new project. It's just the same project in a different folder. They made changes to it and deployed it also. So in the cloud, it has the original project and the new, what they're calling a new project, which is the same one, but in the cloud, it's mixed them together. And when they look at the operation logs of that project, they see both. Well, yes, you're going to see both because it's the same GUID, it's the same project. In this situation, if you want it to be 2 separate projects, what I would do is I would download the version from the cloud currently. And when you do the import of it, there is actually an option that says new GUIDs, which makes it a new project.
Yeah, I'm seeing if I can find that real quick here. My main thing is I created a Jitterpack and I can't find it. So I'm going to do a new one here.
I think it's when you import the Jitterpack.
It is. If we want to jump back over to the screen here real quick, I'm going to show you this. If I do import Jitterpack, when I select my Jitterpack, on the next screen, there's an option here to generate new GUIDs.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. Okay. As you, it doesn't really matter where you put the project, things like that. But particularly if you're saying, hey, here's a project, I'm going to export it, then I'm going to re-import it into the same environment, same agent, all this stuff. You definitely want to do the new GUIDs. Now, again, this is Design Studio. Cloud Studio, I think, operates, the mechanics of this is a little different, but it sounded like this was in the context of Design Studio. So that's what we would want to make sure is done. If you did that and you're running into that, definitely reach out to support. Let's dive into that and see what's going on with that. Okay, so let's see. Let's go on. Great questions, guys. I want to commend you on asking questions today. Sometimes we get a lot, sometimes we don't get many, but we like getting questions. Let's see. Do we have a listener or a connector for AWS, SNS, SQS? I don't know of any on that right now. Ideas portal, go out there, put it down if it's something that you're looking for. Let's see. Different between import data and migrate options.
Yeah, so migrate is going from one project to another project in different environments. Import is going from a file, a Jitterpack, to a project, usually a new project, not over an existing one. So They both are moving data from one to the other. It's just the import data is going from a file.
Okay. Let's see here. There was another question that came up. I saw momentarily popped up there about asking for specific steps on kind of how we go through this process. Not really sure. I'm not sure when that question came in, so I don't know when exactly which part of this. But I'll tell you what, if you send an email to training@jitterbit.com with more details of what you're looking for, we would be happy to try to do our best to help you with that. So let's see here. Another question, could we release some hands-on practice sessions to build simple things? Of course, we've got some of that in Jitterbit University. I'll tell you, we are also actively working on a new tutorial series where we will be going through doing some simple things on specific endpoints. And so hopefully that will help you out there as well. Okay, let's see here. Can we import a cloud project in the desktop version in Design Studio?
That is not currently supported.
Yeah. Now, I will say there is a way where we can migrate some of the Design Studio projects to Cloud Studio.
Yeah, that's supported, no problem. So if you have a Design Studio project, you can migrate that into a cloud project. We just don't support the other way around.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. When you're ready to deploy to production while using Design Studio, if you select the deploy everything, you mentioned that would save a copy of the existing project backup. And you can restore from this backup just in case you find something wrong and need to roll back prior versions. Yes, when you do that deploy, there is a separate checkbox there though, that you have to check. Otherwise, it will not do that Jitterbit backup.
That's correct. And that's actually a space thing. So if we saved every deploy, our S3 account would be many terabytes and quite expensive. So that checkbox is only, it's really milestones, major deploys. Hey, my project is working in the current state. I want to save this. So when you do a deploy in Desktop Studio, check the checkbox, put a note in there so that if you go to download it, you can actually see it. But it doesn't save every copy.
Okay. Functionality differences. Are there big functionality differences between cloud and the Desktop Design Studio?
Well, there is still some things that are not in Cloud Studio, and there's some new things that are in Cloud Studio that are not in Desktop Studio. So it really depends on your use case and what are you trying to accomplish. And
so if they wanted to discuss what their use case was, what would be the best avenue to reach out to?
Most of the time that's during the pre-sales process, but if it's post-sales support, be happy to talk to you about it. There's lots of people, even your sales rep would be happy to talk to you about it.
Okay. And this is the last one in the list so far. We're right at the top of the hour. So if we don't see any others, we'll wrap up after this question. But when running a database to database operation, tables are getting locked. Are there any, is there any setup or suggestions on how to potentially avoid that?
Yeah, we could have had a whole tech talk just about this.
I know.
This is definitely something that is close to my heart. So when running a database to database, your source is going to get locked in certain situations depending on the database, depending on how you did the select. Microsoft SQL Server has a no-lock feature, whether you use that or not. Your isolation level is very important. So especially on your source, set your isolation level to like read committed, but you really have to know your business process. Is records being saved into this table all the time? Are you selecting a subset of records? If you miss a record, are you going to come back to that and get it later? Is this a snapshot so you don't have to worry about changes? So you really have to know your business process on this to know if that's safe to do or not. On your target, obviously, what are you doing there? Are you inserting into a live production table? Is it an archive table? What's your commit status? So we want to commit every 1,000 records. We want to commit every 100,000 records. Obviously, it's going to lock those records in the middle of those. I would recommend doing chunking on your target, using isolation level as recommitted or read uncommitted. But be careful. You don't want to read files or read records that aren't appropriate. Also, there is a global variable that you can put at the beginning of your operation that will tell Jitterbit commit after every chunk. So you're chunking on every 1,000 records, it would commit after every 1,000 records. That will really help the table locking.
Yep.
But like I said, this is a complex issue, and I've just barely glanced over it.
I was going to say, I feel like we just got a bonus tech talk.
But like I said, this is a complex, and database locking in general is not a simple it's not a simple topic. We can have a more in-depth conversation later if you want to put a ticket in with support. We'll be happy to do that. And we may very well need to do another tech talk on database. Very well, absolutely.
We haven't done one on database in quite a while, so we may look at that. So a few other little questions popped in here. Is there somewhere that lists the differences between Cloud Studio, Design Studio, Success Central, success.jitterbit.com? Is there a licensing difference? Can we use either one?
Absolutely, you can use either one.
You can use either one. You can use both. You don't have to pick one.
Correct.
Okay, just not for the same project.
You would have to get real creative to use it in the same project.
Yeah, we would have suggested.
No,
the
only way I think you could possibly do it is you would have part of the project in Desktop Studio and do an API call into a different project that is on the Cloud Studio, so then they could kind of talk to each other, but they would still be two separate projects.
Yep. So you just mentioned API. Can we set up webhooks in
Absolutely.
Projects? Yes, we do it as just APIs.
Yes.
That's what we call it. It's APIs. It does depend on your licensing to an extent.
Yes.
On how many APIs, and different things like that. But yes, you can do APIs. And we do have a previous Tech Talk all about APIs. I'd encourage you to go check that out to see the mechanics of it if you haven't. Okay, I think we got through all the questions. But with that, guys, I know we're 3 minutes after the hour. But like I said, we want to stay on with you if you've got the questions. So we stayed the extra 3 minutes. But again, this will be archived out. We've got the other ones out, success.jitterbit.com. You can search out there for Tech Talks. But guys, also, we'd appreciate some feedback at some point. If you've been on some previous Tech Talks, we're doing a new platform with this one. Let us know. Shoot us an email, training@jitterbit.com. That'll reach directly me and my team. And with that, guys, thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. Have a great day. Jacob, thanks for coming again.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.